So I got cut off a little bit in the last section, but I'll continue with organelles. So what organelles are specific structures within a cell that do specific jobs or functions or roles. And the term organelle means small organ. So the analogy is, if this was a body, the organs in your bodies have specific functions. For example, your heart pumps blood, your stomach digests food, that sort of thing. These are not true organs, they're just structures that have specific functions, and they are covered by a membrane. So the plasma membrane, if you remember, is the outer boundary of a cell, a eukaryotic cell, but the organelles inside also have membranes. So for example, the nucleus is an organelle, and its function, its job, is to keep the DNA enclosed and essentially protected. The cytoplasm is the location between the nucleus and the plasma membrane. So it is this region in light blue, and it's the region that has the organelles within it. So the organelles are suspended within the fluid environment that is the cytosol. Think of solution, right? Cytosol. Cyte, the term, the word root cyte refers to cell. Okay? So a little video here on a typical animal cell. Let me get the volume up for you, and we'll get to watch this. Hopefully.
Even if you're just studying, a lot of work is going on in your cells. Let's zoom down and check it out. We've arrived in the space between two cells. A sticky coat called the extracellular matrix holds the cells together. Each cell is surrounded by a flexible plasma membrane with an incredible number of projections, docking stations, and channels. Let's dive into one of these channels to enter a cell. Whoa, look at this place. These girders and cables make up the cytoskeleton, the structural framework of the cell. They also serve as tracks for transporting cargo from one place to another. All this activity in the cell requires energy in the form of ATP molecules, which are made here in the mitochondrion. Notice the outer membrane and the inner membrane with its numerous infoldings. Many of the molecules involved in making ATP are built into the inner membrane. All those folds increase the inner surface area, enabling more ATP to be made. Moving towards the nucleus, we pass by layers of internal membranes. The nucleus is enclosed by a double membrane called the nuclear envelope. Let's enter the nucleus through a pore. The nucleus houses the genetic material of the cell, DNA, which carries the blueprints for making the cell's proteins. Almost 2 meters of DNA is crammed inside the nucleus. How does it all fit? The DNA is wrapped around proteins like thread wrapped around spools. Look, this section of the DNA has unwound, and a different protein has attached to the DNA. DNA is being used as a template to make mRNA. mRNA molecules travel from the nucleus to the cytoplasm, carrying the instructions for making specific proteins. In the cytoplasm, a ribosome clamps onto a strand of mRNA. The ribosome ratchets along the mRNA, building a new protein. Some proteins stay in the cytoplasm. Others, like this one, are processed in special compartments within the cell. Protein processing and certain other metabolic activities occur in the endomembrane system, the cell's network of internal membranes. The endoplasmic reticulum, or ER, is part of the endomembrane system. There are 2 types of ER, rough and smooth. Rough ER is covered with ribosomes. Smooth ER lacks ribosomes. Lipids are made in the smooth ER. Let's go inside the rough ER. Note that you can still see the ribosome on the outside surface. The ribosome is manufacturing a new protein, which continues to grow inside the ER. Completed proteins move to the edge of the rough ER and depart in a vesicle that buds off from the ER membrane. Some vesicles fuse with the Golgi apparatus, another component of the endomembrane system. In the Golgi, proteins undergo further processing. Finished proteins are then packaged in vesicles that pinch off from the Golgi and are transported along cytoskeleton tracks. Some vesicles bind with the plasma membrane, secreting their contents outside the cell. Other vesicles, called lysosomes, contain digestive enzymes. Here, a lysosome fuses with a worn-out mitochondrion and breaks it down. Each of the trillions of cells in your body is a dynamo of activity, requiring millions of ATPs every minute. But most people are unaware of all this activity in their cells.
Okay, so your cells are little dynamos of activity. Even when you're asleep, there's all kinds of stuff going on. And a quick tour of a plant cell. And we will cover plants in more detail later on, but we'll look at a plant cell now.
Both animals and plants are made up of cells. Their cells have many features in common, but there are a few significant differences. Let's look inside a leaf to take a closer look at a plant cell. First, we encounter a protective cell wall outside the plasma membrane. The cell wall is made from strong cellulose fibrils. Once inside the plant cell, we see the large central vacuole, which regulates the composition of the cytoplasm, creates the internal pressure that is characteristic of plant cells, and stores various compounds produced by the cell. Plants make their own food by photosynthesis in chloroplasts. Light passes through the two membranes of the chloroplast and strikes these green discs, where light energy is converted to chemical energy. The sugar molecules produced by photosynthesis can be made into other molecules or broken down for energy. When sugars produced by photosynthesis are broken down, their energy is used to make ATP in mitochondria. ATP powers the work of the plant cell. Most organelles, like mitochondria, are found in both plant cells and animal cells. So the next time you pass by a plant, remember that we have more in common than meets the eye.
And again, we'll look at this video again when we do plants later on. Okay, this all came out at once, but that's all right. So let's focus on the plasma membrane, which is the boundary, the external boundary of the cell. So it separates the cell from its surroundings, and the plasma membrane, PM here, is mostly comprised of phospholipid, which is a lipid fat type molecule that has what's called a phosphate group, so hence the name phospholipid. And the phospholipids here kind of looks like a matchstick in a way with this gray end and the yellow little things that look like, I don't know, French fries. This is one phospholipid molecule, and the yellow part is the lipid fat component, and the blue part is the phosphate group. So continuing, this is a single molecule called a phospholipid, and because of its characteristics, the yellow part, which is a lipid molecule or molecules, is repelled by water. So what tends to happen is the phospholipids self-aggregate, meaning they tend to naturally form this bilayer. So here's one layer of phospholipid molecules all lined up next to each other with the phosphate end, this blue-gray area, oriented towards water, or liquidy aqueous environment, which is what we have outside of our cells. And then the yellow component, the fatty acid tails, the lipid tails, are repelled by water, so they orient themselves away from water. Aqueous environment meaning watery. Now, inside the cell, in the cytoplasm, or the cytosol, it's mostly water as well. So this layer forms itself with the phosphate group towards the cytoplasm and the lipid part away from the cytoplasm. So the phospholipids tend to naturally form a, bilayer, okay? And that's because of the two basic characteristics and two basic regions of the phospholipids. The head phosphate group, it is charged, has a negative charge to it, so it tends to get orient itself towards water. And then the two nonpolar fatty acid tails are repelled by water because water is a polar molecule. So the phospholipid is an interesting molecule because it has two different characteristics. The phosphate head is charged, and because of that, it is oriented, or it is attracted to the polar water. And the fatty acid tails in yellow, since they are nonpolar, that means they are repelled from water, or repelled by water. And again, that's because water is a polar substance. So, and a lot of things dissolve in water. However, the phospholipid doesn't. And that makes this molecule a perfect molecule to form a biological membrane, the phospholipid bilayer that is the membrane of our cells and keeps the outside environment separate from the inside environment. So there are proteins within the plasma membrane, PM for plasma membrane, and they regulate movement of materials across the membrane, and they also have other functions, as we'll look at. So here's a section of the plasma membrane. So notice most of it is these phospholipid molecules forming a bilayer, and embedded within the plasma membrane are numerous proteins. Some proteins span the entire length of the membrane, some don't. The ones that span the entire length can act as channels. They have passageways through them that allow materials to move into or out of the cell. Okay? And the picture is static. That means the picture is not moving, obviously. But in real life, the plasma membrane, it's somewhat fluid in the sense that things can move around within the membrane. The proteins can shift around and move about. They can actually flip around, change their positions. So the plasma membrane is considered to be a fluid mosaic model, meaning that it is pliable, it can move around, and the components within the plasma membrane, like the proteins, can move around and shift about as needed. So it is fluid because the molecules can move around freely, and it's a mosaic because there's a big diversity of proteins associated with the plasma membrane, and the different proteins have different functions. Again, some can serve as channels, allowing things to move into and out of the cell. Some proteins act as receptors for detecting chemicals or hormones that might be floating around outside of the cell. Okay, so let's look at a typical plant cell. Just like what the video showed you, plant cells have an external cell wall. That means it's outside of the cell. It's produced by the cell, but it's produced and transported across the plasma membrane, which is in yellow, and the material of the cell wall is mostly cellulose. And it's a tough, strong, rigid material, and it gives the cell protection and also helps the cell be somewhat rigid and allow it to maintain its shape. So it's a good material to allow plant cells to get organized like building blocks or like bricks on a wall.